G'day viewers, in this episode we're going to take a look at some material compiled by Ken Wright. The reason I believe this is significant is because Ken Wright met Bob Lazar personally somewhere between 1999 and 2000. This is important because it was, to my knowledge, one of the earliest instances of third-party scrutinisation of the Lazar story by a scientifically trained individual, that is Ken Wright. Moreover, it occurred within approximately 1 decade of the Lazar 1989 revelation. By contrast, the latest significant recantation of the Lazar story occurred in 2018 in a documentary produced by Jeremy Corbell. Ken Wright was a scientifically trained nuclear engineer with the US Navy. Although scientifically trained, he was never a professional scientist. Having said this, he obtained a Master of Science degree in Computer Information Systems long after he left the Navy. Ken developed a theory whereby gravitation is a consequence of the strong nuclear force, that is, the force holding protons and neutrons together in the nucleus of an atom. He developed his first iteration of his theory in 1975. The next major iteration occurred in 1999, followed by another iteration in 2016. This begs the question as to where Bob Lazar got the same idea. Did he get the idea from Ken Wright, or is it mere coincidence that Ken Wright first proposed this as an explanation? Approximately 14 years before, Bob Lazar offered the same explanation in 1989. This is an open question and I'll leave it up to you to investigate. Having said this, I should point out that we have disproven Bob Lazar's claims of dual gravity scales, that is, the atomic scale and the planetary scale. We have disproven this position and, by association, disproven his contention that the strong nuclear force explains gravity. However, I should also emphasise that we have provided clear evidence that at least 3 scientific aspects of the Bob Lazar story are genuine. Moreover, we have demonstrated to a scientific standard of proof that Lazar's so-called gravity B-wave claim of 7.46 Hz is valid. The evidence is contained in our Bob Lazar playlist, so please watch our content if you have not already done so. With regards to Ken Wright, I have reviewed Ken's nuclear gravitation field theory and I do not find it convincing nor compelling. However, I encourage all viewers to investigate his theory for yourself. Do not formulate a conclusion regarding his theory based upon my opinion only. Okay, let's now have a quick look at Ken's meeting with Bob Lazar.
Nowadays, we know how difficult it is to get Bob Lazar to discuss anything related to his experiences at S4. Hence, it is a small miracle that Ken Wright was able to meet Bob Lazar face to face, seemingly sometime around 1999 or 2000. You can see from these photographs that Bob and Ken are considering the so-called sports model reactor design. It is unclear whether this was a model constructed by Bob Lazar or Ken Wright. Either way, it doesn't really matter, as the design has Bob Lazar's endorsement. But where did Bob Lazar get his idea that the strong nuclear force is responsible for gravity? Is it a coincidence that Ken Wright also had the same idea? Perhaps. It certainly could be a coincidence. I doubt whether Bob Lazar and Ken Wright have been the first humans in history to attribute the phenomena of gravity to the strong nuclear force. After all, Christopher Columbus wasn't the first person to prove that the Earth was round. That honour goes to Claudius Ptolemaeus, 1,500 years before Columbus. My point being that coincidences really do occur. Okay, let's now take a quick look at the chronology of Ken's theory. It may help you decide if it had any input into Bob Lazar's claims. Ken Wright produced 3 major releases of his nuclear gravitation field theory. As you can see, the first major release occurred in 1975, when he was a young sailor. The next major release occurred in 1999. It is unclear if this second release included any input from Bob Lazar or not. His third major release occurred in 2016. Once again, I will reiterate that I have reviewed Ken's theory and do not find it convincing nor compelling. Having said this, everyone should always investigate theories for themselves. Do not formulate a conclusion regarding his theory based upon my opinion only. At this juncture, it would be remiss of me not to point out that the mass density of element 115 stated on Ken's website as of the 20th of August 2023 is incorrect. Ken states the mass density of element 115 to be 31.5 grams per centimetre cubed. This value is significantly overestimated and unrealistic. It may be discarded. This is an illustration developed by Ken Wright, and you can find it on his website. It describes the element 115 wedge manufacturing process in 4 simple steps. Step 1 involves stacking multiple discs, one upon the other. Step 2 involves fusing that stack of discs into a cylinder. Step 3 involves milling the cylinder into a cone, and Step 4 involves slicing a fuel wedge from the cone. If you're observant enough, you'll see that Ken Wright depicts 12 discs. Keep this in mind, we'll discuss it on the next slide. Okay, now that we've depicted the simplified process, let's do a deep dive into the complete process. This illustration explains everything we need to know about the element 115 fuel wedge manufacturing process in detail. We can see on the dimension sketch that 16 discs are utilised per cylinder. An obvious question to ask is, why have we determined 16 discs per cylinder and the Ken Wright illustration utilises only 12 discs? Well, I can't answer on behalf of Ken Wright. He may have just been guessing an even dozen. However, in our solution, it's due to the fundamental wavelength. The thickness of each disc is 1/4 fundamental wavelength. The reason for this is because the gravity A wave effect is, in a manner of speaking, switched off at 1/4 fundamental wavelength. This means that the gravity A wave effect is minimised perpendicular to the face of the disc, thus ensuring that when transporting the discs jumbled in a bag, their inherent gravity A wave effect cannot accumulate in any particular direction. If all the discs are randomly jumbled in a bag and the disc faces have all been switched off, so to speak, then the population of discs would be in their safest configuration for transportation purposes. You can also see from the dimension sketch that everything is expressed in terms of the fundamental wavelength, appearing as the letter R. You can see at the bottom of the sketch we have numbered pieces 2 to 8 and pieces 2' to 8'. This means that piece 2 mates to piece 2', piece 3 mates to piece 3', and so on. After slicing and the pieces have been mated by fusing, we have additional element 115 fuel wedges. Hence, each cylinder of element 115 produces 8 fuel wedges, including the primary fuel wedge described by Lazar and shown on the previous slide. Thus, the apparent mysterious slices described by Lazar in the Corbell documentary are not mysterious at all. It all has a very logical explanation. When mated together, each new fuel wedge has a thickness of 1/4 fundamental wavelength. You should also note that once the cone has been sliced, the secondary fuel wedges all have rounded vertices. Let's now look at the table of information. To build this table, we have utilised the official scientific estimate for the mass density of element 115. We have applied the value of 13.5 grams per centimetre cubed. It should be noted that this value is slightly higher than the associated mass density required by the Lazar solution. Lazar stated that the mass of the primary fuel wedge was 223 grams, but we calculate a value of 238 grams. So, utilising the official scientific estimate for the mass density of element 115, we obtain a primary wedge mass result approximately 6.5% greater than Lazar's 223 gram solution. Given that the official scientific value is only an estimate based upon an unstable and fleeting element, no meaningful contradiction can be said to exist. Walking through the table, we see that only 1/3 of the cylinder is machined into a cone. The other 2/3 of material is milled away. If we assume that the shavings are collected, smelted and turned into new discs, then the minimum batch size of discs in order to ensure zero waste is 80 discs. From these 80 discs, 5 cones can be manufactured. This means that if each cone produces 8 fuel wedges, then from 5 cones we can expect to obtain a total of 40 fuel wedges. Please take the time to pause the video and study the contents of the table. It contains too much information to be discussed now. Let's now compare our 16-disc solution to Ken Wright's 12-disc solution. But before we execute the comparison, we'll lay out some of the common characteristics across both solutions. Moreover, we'll do this for a broad range of nuclear isotopes, that is, from 272 to 301, as per our previous episode. As you can see, we have calculated the gravity A wave frequency and wavelength and disc thickness for each solution. It should be quite clear that Ken Wright's 12-disc solution is not vastly different from our 16-disc solution. Please take a moment to pause the video and study the information provided. Okay, let's now summarise what we have learned. On our journey, we have learned 4 key lessons. Firstly, each disk solution does not significantly diverge across a broad range of element 115 isotopes, that is, from 272 to 301, as per our previous episode. Secondly, the 12-disk solution for the gravity A wave remains within the required microwave frequency range. Thirdly, the 12-disk solution does not significantly depart from the 16-disk solution. And lastly, whether or not an illustration depicts 12 or 16 disks doesn't really matter too much. Please take a moment to pause the video and study the information provided. Once again, we stress that the contents of this episode are purely conjecture. The conclusions presented may be incorrect, so viewer discretion is advised.